This webinar is a part of Education Dialogue series that Center for Public Policy Research is organizing within the context of national education policy. To introduce our organization. CPPR is an independent public policy think tank based out of Kochi since 2004. And we have three research centers, namely Center for Comparative Studies, Center for Strategic Studies, and Center for Urban Studies. Together, we cover public policy aspects of governance, economy, international relations, and urban studies. We also have a training and development arm called CPPR Academy. So to know more about what we do, please do check our website, cppr.in, or our social media handle, CPPR India on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. My name is Nissi Solomon, Senior Research Associate at Center for Public Policy Research, and I take great pleasure to introduce our speaker and moderator for the day. We have with us Dr. Shakila Chamchu. She was formerly OSD of New Education Policy in the Department of Higher Education at the Ministry of Education. She has been the secretary to the committee to draft National Education Policy. She was also one of the nodal officers of the flagship Government of India scheme of National Mission on Teachers and Teaching. Her core areas cover education planning and policy making, teacher education, ICT, and open and distance learning and inclusive education. Her academic career spans over 39 years in the University of Mumbai and IGNOU, and over 14 years with the government. She is also a special advisor on education policy at CPPR. We welcome you, ma'am. We also have in conversation Dr. D. Dhanuraj. He's the chairman of the board of trustees and the chief executive of CPPR, of which he is also one of the founding members. He has extensively worked in the field of education, livelihood, and urbanization, and he has co-authored the e-book on Vision for Higher Education Reform and a paper on understanding the status of higher education in India, challenges and skepticism towards serious investments in the sector. For the interest of our panelists, as per registrations, we have a diverse set of stakeholders with equal representation from higher management, educators, young professionals, and students community. So during our Q&A session, we hope to have an interactive session and meaningful dialogues with each of these participants. Before we start with the event, I would state some ground rules. The discussion will be for about 40 minutes, post which the virtual floor will be open to questions. All the participants here can type in your questions in the chat box, and the moderator will address the questions to the speaker during the Q&A. Those joining from FB Live can comment on FB. Our team will direct the questions to the speakers. We also request all the participants except the speakers and the moderator to keep their audios muted. You can follow our live tweet, share your thoughts using hashtag Education Dialogues. In case any of your friends could not join, do let them know that this is live streamed on CPPR's Facebook page. So please visit the page for more details. Thank you. I hope all of you would have a fruitful engagement in this webinar, and I now hand it over to Dr. Dhanuraj.
Thank you, Nissi, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to host Dr. Shakila Chamchu for this education series that we are starting today. And today the focus is going to be on school education and the national education policy impact. Its impact and implementation challenges in the state of Kerala. Dr. Chamchu has worked with this new education policy committee in the capacity as a member secretary, and it's very rare for policymakers or the educators or the researchers to come across somebody who was an insider to come open and discuss about what was happening and what was the motive and what was the intent behind the policy making. So, ma'am, I would like to start with that note. Since you played a major, crucial role in this national education policy framework, could you share us an overview of NEP to the benefit of the participants attendees here? What are the outcomes? What are the intentions, and what are the outcomes that we expect in the national education policy, and how this is going to be according to you, how this is going to be a game changer in the country?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dhanuraj, and thank you to Nisi for her kind words of introduction. See, the education policy, as you know, the current one is the first of the 21st century. We really emphasize that very significantly because many are asking this question: why did we have to have a new education policy? The very fact that you've had a long lapse of time from the previous policy, socioeconomic changes, technological changes, the way that knowledge itself has got metamorphosed, has all resulted with also the underlying philosophy that we are, as a country, committed to the global development goals, the sustainable development goals. And we thought that we should actually look at learning in the 21st century. So the rationale for having a national education policy has started. It was a long exercise. Started in 2014. We had 33 themes identified for consultations, and in a certain sense, this would be one of the largest consultation exercises in any country in the world for policy making, where the body or the volume of suggestions that went into this policy making was about nearly 7 lakhs. 5 lakhs prior to what this committee had done, the committee to draft national education policy under the esteemed chairmanship of Dr. K. Kasturi Rangan, and a very illustrious panel with Manjul Bhargav and Professor Vasudha Kamath and many others. And it's not that I'm just not taking everybody's name, but it's an illustrious panel. Many of you would have gone through that. And that report of this committee also received something like 2 lakh suggestions. Now, why did we want the changes that we suggested in school education is more based on evidence that ECCE plays a fundamental role because it's related to the brain development and the neural networks that are connected at that age, critical ages between 0 to 6. Why do we talk about the 5+3+3+4 architecture? It is not a physical architecture, but a curricular and pedagogical restructuring, so that the approach to curricula, the approach to teaching learning, and the approach to assessment will be modified to actually help learners to learn more effectively. The question is not about learning alone, how to learn in a more effective manner. That is what an education system needs to tell to the students, because today you have technology and internet and so many other sources of information that the role of the teacher itself has got changed from one of information dissemination to being one of a facilitator. But at the same time, the kind of challenges and the kind of jobs that may be coming about requires a total change in the perception of learning. So the entire chapters on school education, the policy, is comprehensive. We are looking at ages 3 to 18 as far as school is concerned, then going to higher, which is a larger age group, and embedding within itself the vocational education, technology in education. So it's a very comprehensive document, and where it recognizes that learning is in a continuum. So the main features of the school education has been to look at the challenges of learning that children have. How can learning be made more effective in terms of learning outcomes? How can we cater to the holistic development of the child, which is very, very critical, because today you have a society where there is a thought process that only 2 professions can be considered, and that is to become an engineer or a doctor. And you need to change that. There are avenues for development in sports, in music, in animation, in so many areas. And that is why in the cardinal principles that we have outlined in the chapter 1, we have started with saying, recognize the unique potential of every single child and contribute to the holistic development of that child through the vehicle of the education system. So I think it might not be appropriate at this stage to sort of unfold all of it, but that has been the thinking to actually make learning more effective, to make our children actually become the center, the focus of the policy has been on the learner. And therefore, to empower that learner, whether it is a learner in the school or a learner in a higher education system or an adult learner, to empower that learner through a very robust education system, which the current system is so rigid. It has to be unstructured. It has to be made more flexible. because we are living in a world which is so flexible. And if you stick to rigidities, if you stick to rigidities in curriculum, if you stick to rigidities in the teaching learning processes, you stick to rigidities in assessment, you will find a bulk of these children falling outside the scope, and we condemn them as being either failures or dropouts, by which we are doing a grave injustice to the potential and the abilities and the talents of the children. And through the new policy, we want to have better knowledge, better capabilities, and better skills in our children. That's the whole idea.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, I think that sets the tone for today's conversation. You just mentioned that there is no physical restructuring, but I think many have raised this. I think many are confused, or they want to clarify this point. When we say 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, what does it mean? Because for most of them, this is nothing but a physical restructuring. Classes. And for example, in Kerala, we have this elementary stage from 1 to 4, then 5 to 7 is upper primary, and 9, 10 is high school, and then higher secondary. So since you mentioned this is not a physical restructuring, can you clarify that point?
Yeah. So the whole, as I said, this policy is based on certain scientific evidence in the way the learning trajectory takes place. And while the 10 plus 2, that structure that we are talking about, is more of a physical restructuring which was done. And many states have schools which are only classes 1 to 3. Some have schools which have classes 1 to 5. Some have only classes between 5 to 8. Some have classes between 8 to 10. And the 11th and the 12th have been distinctly outside the schooling system. Some of them call that as the junior college in Maharashtra and the western part of the world. Rest of us over here, we say that it is the 10 plus 2. Now, this is a physical restructuring. Whereas what the policy has said is that it is an approach to the curriculum. So the foundational stage between ages 3 to 8, which encompasses a very strong emphasis on early childhood care and education. This, the fact that there is evidence which was shared by the Institute of Brain Sciences, which tells us that in a child's brain development, as we see, 0 to 6 is the most critical stage where the nutritional aspect, the health aspect, and the intellectual aspects and the emotional development of the child takes place. So the neural synapses starts getting connected only if you have some activity towards creativity, towards cognitive learning, towards connecting things and so on. But this needs to be done not through formal learning. And the idea of early child care and education, starting from ages 3 to going on to up to 6 years, because we have currently someone joining the class 1 at age 6. So between 3 to 8, and actually we would like between 3 to 8 not to have even classes. That's what the report said. The draft NEP 2019 did not even want classes to say that this is class 1, class 2, and so on. We just wanted it to be a free flow so that children between the ages of 3 to 8, depending on their abilities to assimilate on the basis of creative learning and discovery-based learning and joyful learning, playway method, not formal, no formal paper and pencil at all, were actually to shuttle between these age groups by allowing them to decide which level of competencies that they have acquired. But since, as I said, suddenly having a very unstructured age group between 3 to 8 at the foundational may not have had the kind of receptivity for implementation. We have therefore said the foundational stage is 3 to 8, that is covering the preschool and also classes 1 and 2. Then we have set the preparatory stage between the ages of 8 to 11, which is again saying that this is actually relating to the age appropriate learning. And if you are saying that there is something called age appropriate learning, then the ability of the child to learn and not sort of not being forced down in a certain manner, but actually about the ability of the child to assimilate that is how the curricula needs to be approached at. And therefore, at the preparatory stage also, where there will be actual some element of formal learning coming in, the child is actually getting into a formal learning structure by having the 3 R's, or what we call the foundational literacy and numeracy of reading, writing, and basic numerical abilities that are brought about. And then you come to the middle stage, and that's where the core learning really starts in a full-fledged manner. And in this stage, we don't want the hard separations between the curricular, the co-curricular, and the extracurricular, between the arts and the science, between the vocational and the academic. Allow the child to encourage the child to take up any subject of his or her choice, in keeping with the principle that we will go with the holistic development of the child. So at the middle stage, you're actually getting into a little deeper learning and actually entrenching in the child the ability to make some choices, but moving away from rote learning and trying to have creative methods of learning, application-based methods of learning, introducing the appreciation of vocational arts and other subjects, for which if there are no teachers, we have even said that they can have interns with craftsmen and artisans, which are available in a plenty in the country. And the most critical stage is between 9 to 12, which we call it as the secondary stage, to be seen in one single continuum. And the assessment over here also is not supposed to be high stakes, but is supposed to be one which will allow for the students' creative abilities, the application of knowledge and the practical knowledge, promoting the scientific temper. So the 4 segments that we are talking about is not hard divide. It's not divided in hard segments, in hard boxes. It is only that the teaching institution and the teacher and the parent, as well as the student, needs to understand that this is the best way in which learning would happen, and what is today being dictated in terms of the curricula, in terms of the learning pedagogies. This is something that is foreign to us, whereas this is something that is naturally attuned to the brain development and to the learning trajectory. So schools don't have to restructure themselves. The existing systems remain, except for the secondary stage, which is 9 to 12, in one single continuum. And that part of it is somewhere where the state, since there may be possibility that the +2 is distinctly out of the class 10 system, there may be a way of trying to see how we may have to integrate that. It is only at that stage there's a little bit of challenge that might come in for the states. But otherwise, it is no physical restructuring of schools is expected. We only want the kind of pedagogy that is being used is appropriate to learning, which is specific to the age appropriate learning that children naturally are inclined to do. And in this process, you will be able to take along children with disabilities, that is both physical disabilities and learning disabilities. You see, we have put this thing, support for gifted children. In India, we do not have a policy for fast-tracking gifted children. At the same time, there are a lot of children with learning disabilities, like the autistic children and so on. World over, there is research to suggest that autistic children are those we are considered as twice exceptional, and they have very high abilities in a certain specific area. When you approach in this new way of 5+3+3+4, looking at the ECCE, looking at the foundational literacy and numeracy to address the issues of dropouts, you will also be able to factor out these twice exceptional children. And you will also be able to, in this whole exercise, bring in the equity aspect. You see, currently, you will have a lot of dropouts belonging to the marginalized sections, because you do not allow, because multilingualism also comes in over here. In this whole exercise, our entire chapter 4, if one reads through that, the idea of having learning in home language, learning in their local language, all this is a part of the 5+3+3+4. Let's not see it as independent recommendations. So the issue of learning in local language, promoting multilingualism to promote cognitive abilities, having less stakes examinations to reduce the emphasis on coaching culture, the whole flexibility of approach, which is what today learners are looking for, rather than structured ways where 100 children in a class are not seen as 100 clones of each other, but each one of them is unique. And this policy is an enabling one through this new restructuring of pedagogy and curricula and assessment to look at that flexibility. And I think if it is understood in its true spirit and implemented in the manner that we have envisaged it, I'm sure people would feel so relaxed and appreciate the joy of learning, rather than think going to school is actually a painful exercise. Children would be attracted to come into the schooling system.
Ma'am, the decision to implement these policies, I'm sure this rests with the state governments. And there comes a related question in terms of, even though we are not doing the physical restructuring, there are also concerns about the existing school systems. We have, as I said earlier, we have 1 to 4, then 5 to 7, then 8, 9, 10, and then 11 and 12. Are we looking for an overhauling of the content part, not only of the physical restriction, because that is what envisaged by the policy? So there I see that even the content is a big challenge. People are talking about content, who is going to create the content, and how do we give what's the authenticity, or who is going to approve the content. I see that there's a national book promotion policy is also part of this particular envisaged framework. How do you see that? How do you foresee that in a state like Kerala, for example? I see that we have ICSE, CBSE, the state board, and we also have exams. And there is another point that we need to discuss in detail. Who is going to conduct the exams? And we also looked at, I think, the policy and this is a state level exam, approval agency. So could you elaborate on those aspects as well? Exams, content, and how that system has to reorient. It's not only the system, I think parents and teachers, everybody has to reorient along with the students. Students may not find it difficult because they are the new generation learners, because they don't find it difficult. But those who are implementing it, they have to go through a lot of reorientation. Could you elaborate on those aspects?
Yes. So firstly, I am happy you said that it is the states who are going to implement it. With the policy, one has to accept that education is a subject in the concurrent list, and therefore the implementation of it is largely to be done by the states, particularly when it comes to the school sector. In the higher education, since the higher education institutions are autonomous bodies, you only have broad frameworks within which they actually function. Now, the policy envisages, and currently also what is being done is that the content is not individually decided by state governments. There is a national curriculum framework, and this national curriculum framework, which brings out the textbooks through the NCERT, and which is then adapted and appropriately modified on the basis of the regional requirements. The policy very explicitly says that there will be a new NCF, that is a curriculum framework for school education. There will be a new curriculum and pedagogical framework for early childhood care and education. And this task has been mandated to the NCERT, and the work has already been initiated. We are hoping that by about 2022, through a very major consultative process where states are a part of it, educationists are a part of it, civil society is a part of it, through all this thinking and democratic consensus building, a curriculum framework which is attuned to the NEP vision is actually to be brought out. Let me clarify that curriculum framework is not one size fits all. It is not going to be a uniformized curriculum. It is very, very explicit in the NEP itself that each state and each region will be able to take in certain core part of that curriculum, but will have largely having the freedom to induct and incorporate what might be regional context and what might be regionally that may be more contextualized for the learner. You see, many times students would ask, why am I learning in history about only Mesopotamia? If you tell, even in geography, if you tell fruits that are available in your region, so if you tell in Kerala about jackfruit or things that are available here, the child relates to that much better. Always for school children or for any learning, it has to be contextualized. So local content. So with your apprehension of a national book promotion policy, please don't have the apprehension that there will be one textbook that will be given by the government of India and therefore all state governments will follow that. It is not done in the past and it will not be done in the future also. Every state will have the State Council for Education, Research and Training, which can adapt that curricula which has been given within the broad framework with the regional content, the core curriculum being the same, but modified to take in regional requirements. Therefore, the content will automatically be taken care of. When it comes obviously to this new content that is going to come, the teacher training will become an integral part. And I must mention that there is a whole lot of reforms in teacher education that is being envisaged. By 2030, the 4-year integrated B.Ed is the only eligibility to become a teacher irrespective of the level at which you teach. None of your diploma programs and all these, while we are allowing the 2-year program and we are also allowing a 1-year diploma for graduates who have done the 4-year multidisciplinary bachelor's degree, basically, since we are talking in school education of a teacher who will join early childhood care and education, teaching a 5-year-old, can go on to become a teacher teaching the +2 level because it is the same eligibility and you will create a career growth for that teacher. So when you say the content that is being made, the curricula, the teacher training part of it and the teacher in-service training that we are visualizing, therefore the apprehension that who is going to do that. As far as the assessment, while you might have different boards, we have respected the fact that there are as many as about 47 or 48 boards of assessment across the length and breadth, including the CBSE, the ICSE, and so on. And there is a body that we are looking at to rationalize the assessment so that we move away from the high stakes exams, move away from rote-based memorization testing to other forms of testing where we also want to use technology for individualized and customized assessment, adaptive testing, learning as per the competencies of the child. So within a same class, you can have 3 levels of assessment taking place meant for targeting the high achievers, the low achievers, and the average achievers. All this is possible because we are talking of a body that will be created, which will be a federal structure, which is PARAK. It is a National Assessment Center, because right now what has happened is a particular state board tends to be very lenient and another state board tends to be very rigid and very strict. And when you actually have a calibration being done, you are not actually being able to test them on a same level. And you're putting students in one state at an advantage, another state at a disadvantage. This becomes important when you go in for admissions to the higher classes and you have national level entrance examinations taking place. So PARAK is a body which is trying to actually bring about a rationalization so that all state boards of assessment, as well as the CBSE, as well as the Indian Council for School Education, all of them will have certain common parameters and will have certain testing methods which would allow for children's mobility when they move on from one board to another or from one state to another state. So overall, the institutions only have to be open-minded in trying to say that, when we work out the implementation strategies, and that is for the governmental level, and every school, I would urge every school to work out an institutional development plan where they try to take into account their availability of teachers, their availability of infrastructure, so that then they can make out a case. See, if we want to implement this, this is what our school is lacking. We don't have teachers in these areas. We are lacking in the expertise of training in these areas, the ICT facilities, the infrastructure facilities. And we have thought of solutions where we thought that maybe we can have school complexes, because when we say government and government-aided schools, infrastructure might be a huge deficit, and therefore the idea of a school complex coming together for sharing of resources. So I think all in all, we are the policy has appreciated that states will implement, but they are not to be left alone to sort of fend for themselves. there will be a master plan of action by the government, and the state will have to align and see where it would be. So you are aware, you see, states like Bihar might not be as prepared as Kerala is. So you can't say Bihar will implement all these changes because there are teacher vacancies. First and foremost, filling up the teacher vacancies. If you want anything to happen in the school sector or in the higher education, the faculty and the teacher vacancies have to be addressed first. How fast can you do that would depend upon the budget availability, would depend upon how you can fast track that recruitment and ensure that quality teachers are being taken. So it is, as I said, actions in parallel, but it is not daunting. And we need not be daunted. Things have fallen into place with proper planning of infrastructure, human resources, training. But the most important thing is not to resist it, saying that, no, this is something that the government of India is doing, and therefore we will not try to do that. That cannot take place, because you need to think about the future of the children in your own state, that they should also be beneficiaries of the changes that are happening, which are intended for betterment and not meant to retrograde them.
Yes, ma'am. So I have a related question again, because last year I had the opportunity to discuss the policy to an audience which was attended mainly by the school authorities. So one concern they raised is related to what you answered now, because the policy also states that accountability factor. So all the schools are expected to publish the number of classrooms, infrastructure, even the teachers' qualification, if I'm not wrong. And this was highly objected by some of the leading private schools. And when I presented it, I was actually reading out from the policy, but immediately I got the objection saying that, okay, this can't be done. And then I tried to understand why they're objecting. So I see there is the kind of system that we are following in Kerala, especially in private schools, unaided private schools. Teachers will come and go. There's no continuity. There is no stability. And we don't know actually. Even many times parents are also not aware of what is happening in school in terms of who is teaching, what is their background, and what is the educational background and experience, and so on and so forth. So this NEP is trying to address some of these issues as far as I understand. Could you elaborate on those aspects?
So as a matter of principle, the NEP recognizes and respects the role of the private sector in education, whether it is school education, professional education, vocational education, or higher education. And it is something that we cannot deny. It is very much a part and parcel in contributing to the educational needs of the society. But it also says that education is not a commercial activity, and it cannot be it is a public good, and therefore it cannot be used for private investment, and therefore for commercializing it or marketizing it as a commodity. While many might say that this is in direct contrast to the idea of the GATS agreement, the fact remains that as a social welfare state, we are part and parcel of accepting that the private institutions will also have a role to play, and they will continue to play that role. What the policy said is that we will govern public and private institutions as per the same norms and standards. And therefore, this question of, all the criteria that needs to be followed will be same for whether they are private institutions or whether they are public funded institutions. So government and government aided and private and absolutely private schools with no aid coming from the government will also have to follow the same set of norms. Now, we have said in the chapter on the school governance, the setting up of school standards, state school standards authority. Globally, accreditation of schools is a natural, normal, logical phenomenon. You need to accredit the schools and rank them according to their performances. Now, if you want to have that, you need to have certain basic parameters and performance indicators in terms of the number of teacher-student ratio, the kind of pupil-to-classroom ratio, the kind of infrastructure available, the ICT facilities available, laboratory facilities available, library facilities available. And these are not to be kept hidden, because by the fact of transparency, the best way is not to have inspectorial regime. If you want to move away from an inspectorial and an auditing regime, you need to make things transparent and put it in the public domain for people to see it. As a parent, when I am sending my child to the school, I might like to open the website of that school to know what is the school structure looking like, what are the resources available within the school, and therefore knowing about the teacher qualifications, which means that if the private schools are hesitant to actually put it up, then there is something that is not desirable that is happening there. And that is therefore essential for a government. And it doesn't matter whether that private school is catering to an elite segment of the population or not. It is important for the government to know what kind of facilities are there, what are the teacher qualifications. There has been an instance of a state government where, when the state government was given complaints by the parents about the teaching in a particular private school, that team who went from the state government was not allowed to cross the iron gates of the school at all. It said that you had no business to enter this place. The idea of setting up the State School Standards Authority to prevent such kind of incidents from happening, we would not like it. It is not an idea to actually look with a magnifying glass, but we would like to see that all the parameters, child safety, you have incidents of child abuse that is happening. You've been seeing a lot of unfortunate incidents that have been happening. All these needs to be ensured. And if all these needs to be ensured, it doesn't matter whether the management is the government or whether it is a private sector. And the only thing you can do without having human interface is to use technology for public disclosure through the website. And I think if the private schools are resisting it, then one really needs to understand why they are resisting it, which means that they are not having good practices. And if they're not having good practices, they must be brought to book. And they must be made to ensure that you see, for the higher education, I know the NAC team goes for inspecting. They see a list of faculty that are there on the rolls of that college or that university. And then they will see that same set of persons also being shown in another school or another college or another university. Now, these are things which actually give scope for, unfair practices. The idea in the NEP, as far as correcting these kind of aberrations, is not to use the human intervention where there is scope for corruption, but to use technology and public disclosure so that you will do away with the inspectorial regime and you will only have it through public disclosure. Only when you realize that something is not happening properly, then you will have bodies like the State School Standards Authority. It's not really there to do a policing role, but it is to ensure standards. And for that, we have said a school quality assessment and accreditation framework, the SQAAF, along with the State School Standards Authority, together will be able to bring about a qualitative change in the schools. And the idea is to bring the lower level schools to a higher level by some degree of handholding and mentoring, and trying to say that this is how you can reach those levels of performance indicators by which you can get into better levels of learning outcomes of the students and better quality of teaching and learning.
So, ma'am, one of among the so many critics, one of the critical points is about, even though NEPs are giving a very flexible framework in terms of, I try to explain what I mean by that. We have a national framework, for example, textbook we discussed. We are giving some common elements, but it's up to the state state level educators to decide what to be included, how to contextualize and customize it. But at the same time, now we are talking about the standardization process. Then they say, like, this is exactly opposite the very idea that the larger NEP is envisaging. Because even though we talk about, even though you said about, be away from the Inspector Raj, but by just disclosing the teachers' background experience, what they are doing, or the school infrastructure, and all. Aren't we also restricting the entry of those educators who really want to play a role, but by setting the standards, will it restrict the entry of those who because I am reminded by some of these great works done by James Tooley and all. I'm sure you are familiar with those works. They said India, the studies in Hyderabad and all. They talked about school entry level barrier in school education for those educators to enter the school education field are so high that most of the time in Hyderabad slums, this is one of the study areas for them. They found out that schools are actually taught in bedrooms. I mean, one local teacher will be there because there are not sufficient school infrastructure. And also to have that, I think this is a debate in India for so many decades now. For some of the standardizations that we have set in education, especially school education, you need to have a playground, you need to have, but in the heart of the city, how is it possible for somebody to invest that much and it becomes costly? Then, of course, your private school education will be only meant for the elites. So how do you address these issues that people raise on national education policy?
Well, when we talked about the State School Standards Authority, I'm sure all of us as educators realize that there is an ideal pupil-teacher ratio. And the reality may be very different on ground. You might ideally say it should be at a certain class level, 1:30. And then if teacher vacancies are not filled in, obviously there are instances in this country of multi-grade teaching, of single teacher schools, of para teachers, teachers who are actually not there on the rolls, but I am appointed as a teacher and I am nicely busy with my own agricultural farm and I am getting 50,000. I pay this fellow 20,000. The fellow is not even a class 8 pass, but he goes and teaches. This is the reality. This is the reality of India across the length and breadth of this country. Kerala may not see that kind of a situation because it is educationally a very, very advanced state. And here the teacher appointments are very transparent and so on. Now, to lay down standards is not uniformization. It is only because performance is related to that. Now, I fail to understand that if you want to take an educator, see, as of now, it is very true, even in the committee we discussed, we have members who said that we want to come into teaching, but I don't have a B.Ed. And if I don't have a B.Ed, I can't teach in a school. I don't have a B.Ed degree. So how much ever I would like to enter into teaching in a school, I am not qualified to teach that. But there are many ways in which you can use, or if there are educators who want to actually contribute, you can have so many innovative ways in which you can do that. You can have a session in which you use that educator, you use the kind of resources that educator is having through the institutional framework of the school without actually getting them. So we actually, in this policy, have said that for the foundational literacy and numeracy mission, we have said that we will take in social workers, we will take in senior peer students and so on. Now, this is an opportunity, and including the idea of a mentorship program. So there is an idea where you might not be actually, there may be educators who may not have B.Ed qualification and therefore cannot be on the rolls of a school, but they could be there as mentors. There could be there as people who would like to support the institution in taking forward many of these missions like foundational literacy and numeracy and so on. So we have kept for some inroads where there is a scope for the conventionally qualified teacher not maybe getting an access to get it as a formal teacher. And mind you, we have also recognized that even the higher education faculty, when you talk about a community kind of a school and a college being there, that there has to be a social commitment where even a college faculty can go on to sometimes contributing to teaching of the secondary school teachers. So schools can bring about this kind of flexible arrangements. But it is a fact that if you see this country has, if you give that leeway, that no, you can take in non-B.Ed people also, then you do have doubtful intentions because it need not necessarily be used for the purpose for which it is intended. And therefore, these, wide-ranging flexibilities, we have not reached that degree of maturity to really use that for the intended objectives. And that is why the policy does give you that enabling one. But it is difficult, and I think laying down standards is not a mechanism by saying that this is contradicting to the idea of flexibility of approach. Standards have to be there. You need not have playgrounds, but you should be able to at least tie up with a playground, and that is why we set up a school complex. So
I was coming to that point. I mean, could you elaborate on this?
A playground in every school. We need not have a music teacher in every school. We need not have a sports teacher in every school, but you need to share the resources. We have to accept that learning is an activity which needs to have a community orientation, and all schools need to come. Let's not think that once I close the iron gates of this school, everything that is there is holier than the cow, and therefore nobody can touch it, nobody can see it. My students will not mix with others. That way learning does not take place. We need to unshackle that thought process altogether.
So, ma'am, could you give more insights on the school complex you mentioned?
Yes. So the government and government-aided schools, and we are hoping, because we did not have the courage to put even the private in that school complex, but we have said that the secondary and the higher secondary and all schools, because this part of the world, we don't have schools which are classes 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, 8 to 10, and so on. We have largely schools which go on for classes 1 to 10, and then you have your +2 that is separate. But there are a large part of India, which is particularly the northern part of India, where there are schools which are having unviable numbers and who are located in, and we have put in our policy that from middle school, all students can take up, I can take up English, or I can take up Hindi, or I can take up Urdu, or I can learn music, or I can learn a sport, or I can learn a vocational subject, I can learn maths and science. There are no teachers. And how do you go about that? How do you go about having the library facilities? How do you go about having the laboratory facilities? How do you have the ICT infrastructure? So we have said that there could be a mapping of the schools to create a school complex. There could be principals of the existing schools, but there would also be a school complex management committee. So other than the SMCs, you will also have the school complex managing committee, which would have all the principals of these schools, including the head teachers and so on, and look at how you could work out the sharing of the physical, infrastructural, and the human resources to the optimal level. And if there is a question of actually difficulty in moving, you see, somebody mentioned that if you see some part of India, there is a huge hillock in between two schools. On the map, it will look as if it's only about 1.5 kilometers. But in between the two schools, there is a hillock. And therefore, if you have to transport, you actually need to go around the hillock, which is not viable as such. So this kind of mapping, which the district administration and the block level administration is aware of, that department, and that is where the Department of School Education, which looks after the operation, along with the schools, will create not only the SMCs coming together, but a school complex management committee. And if at all it is a question of transporting either the teachers or the students, work out the transport facilities so that this is possible. Now, this may not be possible on a daily basis. And that's what I said, working out all these minute details of implementation is very, very critical to optimizing all these recommendations in letter and spirit. But we have said language teachers, performing arts, all this, because we want children to learn music. We want them to learn about the various cultural forms that are there. And these all should be considered as contributing to the curricula and the weightage. So right now you think somebody who's learning music, no marks should be given. Then the person comes for admission to the higher level. No, music is not to be counted. We will only take your PCM combination or your PCB combination or your other social subjects combinations depending upon the stream. We are doing away with all that. And that is why even in the school complex, working out the minute details, transporting either the teachers or the students, don't close down schools, because India is a country where access to education is a critical factor. And if you close down schools and then say that all students will have to go to a big school, which is also been tried out in Rajasthan and Gujarat, but we would not like to have that, but that may have worked out in that particular state. But that need not be the model when we work out school complexes in other states. So we have kept equity considerations and said a school complex might help to overcome the deficits in infrastructure and human resource deficits.
I'll open up the discussion to the floor. Floor is open, but before I take questions from the audience, I have one last question to you about technology, because I'm sure we are living in 21st century and India is one of the leading tech ecosystem in the world. And I think every other paragraph in that policy, I was reading it again today, I could sense a tech element coming in various places for various positive elements. But many critics have this opinion that this is in the implementation process. The challenge would be, for example, Kerala last 4 years, the government has taken so many initiatives. One of the initiatives is to improve the physical infrastructure. Along with that, I think they're also improving the classroom teaching aids, including introducing technology. I think the policy talks about app also, and I even read the parents are going to get a certificate, progress report, that is artificially AI-enabled certificates. So somewhere I read this criticism that this is going to make an inequitable distribution at the end of the day, because this is going to be again, on the paper it looks very good, nice, very very impressive, but that may not be the case while we implement these policies. How do you react to that?
So I think in a certain sense, the silver lining to the dark cloud of the COVID pandemic, where you've seen the acceleration in the use of online teaching becoming almost an inevitable reality, where we were totally unprepared for. And in fact, the chapter 24 was written in the month of March after the COVID pandemic struck this country, actually, struck the world, actually. But the fact is that there is a digital divide. And it is a reality, not just for the parents and the students, but also for the infrastructure that is available with the state governments. Now, taking this factor into account, while that is a reality, that cannot be seen as something that deters us from going towards the use of technology. The fact is that while we accept that learning in early ages takes place best in a face-to-face environment and in-person learning, challenges of this kind and the fact that we need to move towards blended forms of learning, and it is possible because you can also have offline education possible. There are ways in which you need to leverage multimedia. And you see, when we have the Digital India, not just now, it is much earlier. We've started it in 2005, trying to provide the optical fiber network connectivity and setting up of the common service centers for those who cannot afford to have digital devices. But now what has happened is the pandemic actually forced us into going in for a technology acceleration. Now here, the combination of methods where you need to actually give learning material to the students. So a simple postage of learning material which students can learn. And since we are emphasizing on local languages, it could be bilingual material that could be given so that parents also are able to, at least in our part of the state, we don't have illiteracy as one of the issues. So people can read Malayalam. But there are parts of the country where parents are not able to read and write. So at least in some parts of our country, we are able to have bilingual material going, use the community radio, use offline teaching. But what is most important is that the fear that we are having right now is there's a plethora of e-content that is available and which has high predatory practices to actually force in children take on their methods of learning. But there is no such thing that is adapted to the curricula that is there for this classroom learning. And therefore, when as teachers, and as educational institutions, we can tell children that this content is available in the open market or it is a free source available thing, but adapted to the curricula that is meant for that particular classroom learning. Now, upgrading digital infrastructure, making as a part of social welfare devices available to the students, making it multilingual for different language abilities. At the same time, having training, not just for the students, but also for the teachers, also for those who are the functionaries, and most importantly, the role of the civil society and the industry. Let us understand, when we invest in education, the beneficiary of that is the industry. And the industry cannot afford to remain silent spectators, accumulate their profit, and not contribute to that exercise at all. I think we as a country where philanthropy is just not there at all, and it is only the kind of individual good that we think of, we need to actually start thinking of models where there is a closer contribution and a greater involvement of the industry and the civil society in addressing the technology divide that we are having. But it is a fact that we will have to move towards online learning. It can be a blended mode, but the onslaught of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which are realities, and where our children and grandchildren are more adept than we are because we don't belong to that millennium at all, they easily adapt to using these technologies. It is our ability to think that this is difficult, whereas they are learning it. There is a pressure. The COVID has somehow been a silver lining in this whole exercise, which has forced us to open our ways of innovative thinking and actually think that yes, we need to embrace technology, and that technology can be an enabler at the same time as a social welfare state and the industry contribution address the digital divide issues also, including the regional content being available in the regional languages.
Sure. So, ma'am, I take the first question from the attendees. Bhaskar is having this question. Bhaskar is asking about the mental health, how the mental health issues are addressed in the NEPM. Sure, I mean, you could reflect on the social workers and the counselors mentioned. Could you give a detailed answer to that question? How the mental health issues are going to be addressed in
the policy recognizes the need for counseling of children, and policy recognizes that the current educational system with so much of peer pressure, societal pressure, parental pressure, and high performance has resulted in a lot of stress in the students. And therefore the policy feels that and therefore we are also concerned, in fact we have a Supreme Court directive that the incidence of children going in for drug abuse and substance abuse is a matter of grave concern, and particularly having percolated down to the school levels. Earlier it was confined to the higher levels. Why do children go in for all this? Why are there more student suicides? All this is a larger underlying thought process where we recognize that the mental fitness of the child is also very closely related to the physical fitness of the child. That's why we have said that the midday meal scheme will be extended. You see, the hunger pangs, currently what is happening is, it is a reality in this country that children who come and attend the school, you have inflated enrollments because their younger siblings, their older siblings are all taking that midday meal. But if there is a 24-hour gap between that meal, because there is no meal in the house, the poverty is so much that there is no meal in the house, the brain does not seem to function at all. And that is why we said, can we add the breakfast to that? Can we have more nutritional value going into that? Promote the physical fitness of the child so that the child is having all aspects of physical fitness also being promoted, including sports for the disabled, including allowing for activities like the eco clubs and so on, many activities in which children can participate. At the same time, reduce the pressure of the examinations and the coaching class culture, and therefore the role of the social workers, the role of mentors, These all are supposed to look at the psychological and mental aspects of children's health. And already schools have appointed counselors, and it is becoming an increasing trend. And the fact is that mental health crisis has actually increased during the COVID times. And not only for the children, it is there for the adults also. And therefore, the isolation that has happened is something that we need to address, because while children are connected on social media to Facebook and Instagram and so many other kinds of platforms, there is no joint family where in the past it was the older generation which addressed issues that children faced. So the school's role in having counseling is a very critical factor. And since the school teacher is already overloaded, to expect them to double up as counselors would not have been the appropriate solution. That is why we have thought in terms of the community coming in, and therefore there would be retired teachers, there would be social workers, but the rider is that there should be some norms because of the factor of child abuse and sexual abuse of children, and therefore the child safety being a very important factor. So we cannot have anyone just claiming to be a social worker coming into the school because you're dealing with the tender child, and therefore those parameters of safety will have to be taken into consideration. But counseling, yes, will be one way in which we will try to address the mental health of the children through, of course, the idea of physical fitness and proper nutrition being provided through the midday meal scheme.
Well, I think we need some more clarification on this aspect. There are a few questions related to that. I'm just trying to summarize the whole point.
Yeah.
When we are saying we are going to have counselors and social workers attached to the school, is it going to burden the school system and the school management? I'm not talking about the school system, school management. If suppose the management is a private management, because there is always a question about, finally they have to pass this, cost to the parents. So this is going to be a costly exercise. There is one more question about regarding the same. Because there is some mention, I think you can clarify that some teachers could also be trained for that. So I think some teachers are raising this issue that we are already, we already have a heavy load in school, and now we are asked to do all these things also in addition to what we have been doing. So my question to you is, summing up all these concerns, what is the financial part of this, implementation? Number one. And number two, what is that minimum maximum standards that we are setting? Because I'm sure there are any policy for that matter, certain things are, it's mandatory, and certain things are not mandatory, but it's an envisioned process. So what are they, and how do you differentiate and give the clarity to these challenges?
So what is finally the goal of a school? It is not just to ensure that your class 10 and class 12 examinations come out with 100% pass results. You are equally responsible for the well-being of a child. And if that is not an entrenched goal of a school, I think a school needs to start looking at what it is really doing. It's not doing just the passing of the students. Yes, the financial implications, there are two ways to address that. As I said, we need to look at corporate social responsibility and leverage individual philanthropy. There are a lot of schools which would have students who have come out from that school successfully, have set up wonderful enterprises and are doing well, and we should be happy and proud about it. But I'm sure that they need to start investing in trying to fund some of these activities. That cannot necessarily come, even for government schools, it need not necessarily come from the budget, from the state government. But of course, in a school complex, for example, we would think in terms of having a counselor. We would think in terms of having a social worker. Now, for teachers, we have not made it mandatory for teachers, but I'm sure there are some teachers who would find pleasure in trying to say that they try to address some of these needs of the learners also. Ultimately, teaching is not a 9-to-5 job where I go into an office sign the attendance register and then start doing something on my table and then come out of it. You're shaping the future of this country. And if you look at that job role in that manner, we are not saying that you should have additional load, but if there are teachers who are willing to do that, please come forward to take that up. The policy has not made that mandatory. So you have to work out multiple models. Let me mention that what is essential and what is recommendatory. It is essential that we look at the mental well-being of the child. How do you do that? We have not laid down any specific strategy, but we are giving to you multiple choices. And when we have the implementation strategy, each state can work out its own strategy. Can we have retired teachers? Can we have mentors? Can we have past students who do it as a part of their additional work? Can we have existing teachers who have left their jobs because of some issues but would be able to contribute only as counselors? These are all multiple choices. If we start thinking out of the box, I'm sure we will be able to find the solutions, and these will be listed out in the implementation strategy. Mind you, Government of India is not going to sit and dictate that these are the strategies. Each state, as I mentioned, each school, come down to the institutional level. Let us have an institutional development plan. Can we work out whether there can be CSR? Can we work out whether there could be a civil society contribution? Can we have older students or students who are doing well contributing to individual philanthropy for this? Set it up in their name. If you're saying that we will have a counseling center, it could be in the name of XYZ, who's contributed to that and who's meeting the expenses for paying the honoraria to the counselor. It's not going to be an additional post that is going to be created, but some post that is being taken on an engagement basis, which will be more of a contractual kind, so that the school would have the flexibility. Because when you take in people on a regular post, then it comes to their pension and so many other factors, which is a recurring expenditure. So you have to work out a financial package, but factor that this is a critical part of the mental well-being of the child, and therefore that counseling needs to be provided, not for just the academic part of it, but also for the psychological part of it. But academic is also important when you come out to the stage of the secondary stage, when you move from the middle to the secondary stage, to make the right kind of curricular choices, depending on what careers the child would like to take. Children seem to be having no idea as to what career choices they need to make. But these need not come out the regular budgets of the state governments or the regular budgets of even the private schools, and they can think of many other ways of corporate social responsibility coming into. And private schools are actually benefiting from that, because I'm sure there are lots of parents who would be able to do that as part of it. It's for the government, when we think of the NGOs and the civil society and the industry partners, we find that being difficult. It's not so difficult for private schools at all. But for the teachers, if teachers do not want to do that, I'm sure we are not going to make it very mandatory for them to come forward and do it.
Sure, ma'am. So next question comes from Joshua Kerketa. Joshua is from SOS Children's Village, and his question is regarding right to education. Does the NEP speak about right to education? And would you like to throw some light upon right to education and the Act under new education policy?
So I think it is chapter 9 where we talked about the school governance and the setting up of the State School Standards Authority, where we talked about the separation of functions between the Directorate of School Education, the Department of School Education, the setting up of the State School Standards Authority, and the SCRT framing the SQAAF, where we have written as a paragraph that since the policy is looking at ages 3 to 18, the current Right to Education Act of 2009, effective from 1st April 2010, is only looking at 6 to 14. And therefore, since financial resources, the RT Act itself has, the states bring out their own amendments to the Act in terms of appointment of teachers and so on. So the entire financial burden, since we were not as a committee, and I think even for the government when we brought out the policy, being sure as to the kind of resource window that we have, the resource envelope that we have, to talk of openly saying that the education would go down 3 years below 6 and 4 years beyond 14, which is a huge financial investment. But we have said that in trying to promote the sustainable development goals and ensure universal retention in schools as per the goal articulated in NEP 2020, we may have to revisit or look at how the RTE Act needs to be looked at. Now, we have in the Making It Happen, the part 4 of the policy, talked about rejuvenating the body that is in existence since 1920, the Central Advisory Board on Education. The RTE itself became an act only when this federal body, which has all the state education ministers, along with a number of eminent educationists and people from various walks of life, making a decision that we should have it as a right to free and compulsory education. Do we want to say that the right to free and compulsory education should encompass children between 3 to 6 and from 14 to 18? Or would we like to say that we will try to have efforts to ensure universal access and retention of all children? Now, this decision, the policy left it open-ended merely because this being a matter in the concurrent list, this being a matter in which the resource availability has a state share coming into it, and different states have different allocation of budgets for education, this decision will only be taken by the rejuvenated Central Advisory Board on Education, which will have to meet when talking about the implementation of the NEP. But we have left the scope open in the policy. The Act, getting it amended, is a huge legislative exercise. At the same time, what is the view or the consensus or the majoritarian view of the state governments is something that is to be taken as decided in a meeting of the Central Advisory Board on Education. And therefore, at this stage, saying that the RTE Act will be amended would be, I would say, too inappropriate timing to mention that, because a call has to be taken by consensus of the central and the state governments coming together and discussing and thrashing out that discussion. But the policy has talked about universal access and retention of all children entering at the age of 3 to the age of 18. And that is a goal that we wish to achieve by 2030. And it is based on that goal that we set the target of reaching 50% of the GER in higher education by 2035, giving that 5-year window for the transition period between the school to the higher education.
Ma'am, adding to what the last statement you made, many have this, confusion regarding the timelines that you set. There are timelines like 2025, 2030, 2040. Could you explain the different timelines and what are we trying to achieve?
So actually in the draft NEP, we had a more ambitious timeline for the higher education GER of reaching 50% by 2030. But when we started writing the policy and we realized that the number of dropouts that we have in classes 1, 2, and 3, and therefore what we envisaged as the foundational literacy and numeracy mission, ensuring that children all in this age group, all dropouts, will be brought back into the schooling system. We thought that this 5-year period can help us to achieve that. But that also, one must say, seems to be very, very overambitious. Can we actually do that? Because it is an effort where states also need to come forward, map their number of dropout children, actually go down to the minor absolutely grassroots level, send their cluster resource center worker to the school, fetch that child back to the schooling system, ensure that they have achieved their foundational literacy, and so continue into their education system. Now, we have said by 2030, assuming that a child is entering the school at the current age of 20, in the year 2020-21, at the age of 6 years, that is now, we want that the child will complete up to 18 years. And we are hoping that by 2030, this flow of all children continuing without dropping out at any stage was set. But I'm sure that 2025 will have a spillover for maybe additional 2 years. The 2030 would have a spillover for additional 2 or 3 years. And that is why when we set the GER target, we did not stick to 2030, but we stuck to 2035. So you're actually having a window from now, 15 years, to ensure the universal access and retention. But why timelines become important is that while policies are always implemented in phases, if you set timelines, then you might exceed that timeline by a year or two. But if you don't set timelines and targets with those timelines, you will not tend to achieve it because you will have varied timelines. But even so, you will have this issue that different states may have reached that timeline much earlier than maybe other states. And that is something that we will have to be prepared in a country which has varied educational development indicators being achieved by different states.
So next question comes from Veena. Veena is asking about the floating population, if those children moving from one state to other state. I don't think it is not confined to the issue of language. It's more, she's trying to mention about because there is no uniformity. I think we already mentioned that national level, that flexibility is given to the states to customize. So since there is no uniformity, children going on transfers, local language, content, different style of teachings, how are we going to address those issues?
So we are actually thinking that because we are allowing for the flexibility, let us assume that a family has moved from Kerala to, let's say, West Bengal. And here the child has learned Malayalam and English and maybe Hindi or Sanskrit or Urdu or whatever. And there when the child is going, the child is having Bengali. Since we have not made it mandatory for children to learn the languages in the manner that we have talked about it, one is the language part of it, where that flexibility would be there. And since we are talking about all schools trying to do a mapping of having teachers available in local languages, and since there are diverse languages spoken, we will have possibility of at least 2 languages getting synced. As far as the core curriculum of, let us say, math, science, and English, which remains more or less common, this would not have an issue at all. But as far as the other subjects are concerned, since we are offering a bouquet of courses to the child, and we are not penalizing the child because the child is not going to take the same set of subjects, that mobility, in fact, gets more easily enabled in this implementation rather than what it is currently. Currently, when you have students moving from one state to another state, the child is forced to learn languages. And let me also say, while saying this, actually the ability of children from central government families, actually children pick up all those languages because default, the child is being forced to learn other language in the current system, which is not going to be there in this NEP when we talk about the multilingual choices that we are allowing. And therefore, there is a greater flexibility. And since the approach to the teaching learning processes are more or less aimed at actually enabling the children to learn how to learn, we do not think that the current rigid patterns will have the current rigid patterns actually make it difficult for those who are a floating population, whereas this policy has taken into consideration a floating population, including the migrant labor. And we have talked about alternate forms of schooling, including homeschooling for the very first time. So in fact, the ministry is actually having a challenge and saying that if you're talking about homeschooling and a parent decides, which is what is happening in Pune to a very great extent, where parents withdraw their children from the schools because it is so structured and give them the homeschooling and allow them to appear for the board examinations on their own. The question is, how do you actually determine what is going into the curricular content to talk about an equivalence to reach the class 10? So the possibilities of alternative schooling, open schooling, the possibility of homeschooling along with the flexible structures, I don't think are going to be defeatism for the migratory children, but in fact, or for the migrating families, but in fact, it is more supportive to that setup, which is currently difficult. It is becoming less difficult now.
No, I add to what you replied, what you answered. This question comes from Rajiv Bindu. Rajiv is asking about how justified are we in sending children on such an early age to a formal institutional environment? Because I know 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 means you are starting your education at the age of 2. I mean, it's not education, numeracy and all. So the foundation level. So the question here is, if you could give some scientific insights to this argument.
That's because we didn't understand what ECCE is. What is presently being done in our play schools and in our preschools.
And then I just want to add one more question. The kindergarten, Kerala, we have kindergarten, whether it's part of this system. It's going to be part of the system.
So in the kindergarten sections, and which we call as play schools or preschools, we are actually in fact, when the interviews of the parents are being done, along with the children for admissions to these high-flying schools, we are actually asking them to say, can you say A to Z? Can you say 1 to 100? Can you say Jack and Jill went up the hill, and so on and so forth? We don't want, at that age, children between the ages of 3 to 6 actually doing any of these things. It is where they are actually being told these are numbers. You don't have to tell them that this is in a sequence, that it happens like this. You don't have to actually tell the alphabets as it happens like this. It is actually giving them a lot of playing material. It could be clay, it could be crayons, it could be anything. Allow the child, you show them shapes, you show them colors. The child has to discover that. As we said, since we are seeing a popular ad talks about how the 1,000 days of a child is so important for the nutrition. The 1,000 days of the child is equally important from that neural synapses getting connected. And for that, we should not have the formal learning. What we are concerned is the ambience of the school, which should allow for a kind of fun loving. And that is why if you read the chapter on ECCE, we have even said the way in which a play school should be there should be so attractive, should be having an ambience, but at the same time keep concerns of safety in mind. That remains primary because you're dealing with a very tender child. And at that stage, having a teacher or ECCE teacher along with a teaching assistant, and that is where the standards come in. Because right now, this is an unregulated sector. The policy wants that state governments who are appreciating the health and the safety of their children, who are going to daycares because parents are working, and then suddenly they are also converting themselves to kindergarten or play schools or preschools, are actually doing a grave injustice to the children by actually forcing them to do formal learning, and therefore the child's creative ability being totally destroyed. And therefore we want the ECCE level to be regulated. We know that it is there. And we want that kind of regulations which will lay down the standards. This should be the space. If there are 30 of them, then this should be the space. These are the playthings that the institution should have. These could be the indigenous playthings. We don't have to think in terms of having everything from foreign countries, but it could be there are indigenous ways, the ways that we have also learned using all the local material that is available. This should be the ratio in which there should be a helper to address that. The child does anything. The child can swallow things. The child can inhale something. All these concerns of safety being in place, we need to regulate the current private sector operators who are doing grave injustice of providing these facilities. I'm not saying that it is wrong, but they are not doing it in the scientific manner which helps the child's natural growth of learning. And at the same time, some of them are doing it as commercial ventures. And the state will have to step in, even if it appears that we are regulating, but to take care of the tender health of a child in that age group, I think the role of the state becomes very important. And I'm sure even each one of us with our own conscience should be able to understand that you can't have a daycare center which was there for 5 children suddenly becoming a kindergarten school where you have 30 children and all of them are there from morning 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. That is not the kind of hours children are supposed to be in a what we call a daycare center. That can be a daycare, only for daycare. You don't put that for the child to do activity-based learning. And if it is not activity-based, but forcibly having formal learning, we need to change that pattern. And I'm sure all of us as conscientious parents will recognize that any child, irrespective of their socio-economic background, is entitled by the human right to say that they will get safety, they will still have an encouragement to learning. At the same time, there should be an ambience that makes it attractive for joyful learning and creative learning. That is the whole idea. And I think your apprehension that Rajiv is mentioning is very much on board. And the policy is not saying that we will bring a 2-year-old into the child and then make them child forcibly sit there, use a stick and say that the child will learn it in this manner. That's not what the policy is saying.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Amit Chandra. Amit has worked extensively in India and abroad, school education. His question is about what was the need to change the education pattern from 10+2 to 5+3+3+4? To explain what he's asking, if we want to add 3 more years, would it be easier and simpler if we had added 3+10+2? Why did we do 5+3+3+4?
No, so the rationale which I had told, it is related to the evidence that there is something called age-appropriate learning. And therefore, that the idea is not to segregate that. The idea is when you say foundational stage, 3 to 8, we did not want class 1, class 2 and all that. We wanted it to be left free, totally unstructured. And that's the pattern that we would like it to happen. And since India has a huge population, let's not use Finland models and things that don't work in countries like ours. Those Nordic states may have a population numbers which allow for that. We have a huge population coming into the schooling system. And when we look at the 3-year-old, why we want the 3-year-old? Because the dropouts that happen in the class 1, the learning divide or the learning crisis that is happening is that those who went to the kindergarten or the play schools or the preschools, their learning preparedness to actually pick up reading, writing, and numerical counting abilities is already there because of the cognitive development that has happened in the brain. The child who went an Anganwadi system did not have any of these things taking place. And that child is actually coming to a class. It's like me sitting here and talking to you in maybe Greek language for 2 hours. And the child is not understanding anything that is happening in the class. What does that child do? That child goes back and says, I'll not go to school tomorrow. That learning crisis is what we wanted to address by bringing about the learner preparedness through the ECCE, a very robust system, and allowing the competencies of the child to be optimized as per the child's talents and abilities and potentials. And then going on to the preparatory stage, where you introduce the child to the formal learning, having done up to grade 1 and 2, the common level, and that's why that foundational literacy and numeracy is seen in a mission mode to actually bridge this learning divide that is there between those who are learner prepared, having better learning preparedness, and those who do not have. And therefore, it is not numbers. The idea of 5+3+4 need not be seen as numbers. It is actually seen as the approach to the learning, and therefore the kind of curricular exposure, and therefore the kind of pedagogical tools that the teacher needs to have. And accordingly, the changes in the assessment, moving away from memorization to maybe more analytical thinking that we can ingrain in our children, and which is there as a potential, but which the current rigid system is actually killing it altogether because you're forcing the child to learn by memorization without understanding. So it is actually enabling an understanding, and therefore it is not numbers or statistics that we're talking about, adding this number or that number. The entire structure is related to the way in which we should approach the curricula for better learner preparedness, help that child in learning how to learn in an effective manner to achieve better learning outcomes. And therefore, it is not numbers for us. It was only the ages related to that, which we tried to correspond to the grades or the classes that are currently there in existence. So it is within the system, we are only having a restructuring, and that was the rationale. And therefore, it is not numbers of adding 3 or so. It is only a question of looking at the ages 3 to 8, 8 to 11, 11 to 14, and 14 to 18, corresponding to those classes of early child care, class 1 and 2, then the classes 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 10. That was how it is. And for us, it is so much internalized that it is not seen in terms of numbers at all. It is seen in terms of the ages corresponding to the classes, and therefore the learning that needs to happen corresponding in that manner to the curricula, to the teaching learning process, and the concomitant assessment that goes with that.
So, ma'am, my next question is from the teachers community. Okay, those who are already in service. They say the policy doesn't reflect on how are we going to improve the effectiveness of in-service teacher training programs. There's no incentive system. Some say there is no incentive system. Some say that even though there is an incentive system, there is no collaborative approach with the management and the entire ecosystem that we are envisaging. For the new teachers, is easy. We can develop them, we can train them. What about those teachers who are already in this?
So I think this policy has 2 detailed chapters on the teachers itself. And both for teacher education as a discipline that nurtures teacher education and prepares teachers for all levels. The second is the fact that we recognize that teaching as a profession needs to come onto a different pedestal altogether, and that we need to provide for a career growth for teachers. And I am having my own doubts if we have not said that we will not provide training to teachers at all. I don't think we could have made such a blatant miss in trying to say that. Remain silent.
No, it's all about incentives, man. It's all about incentives, not about incentives.
No. So one, we have said that teachers, as far as possible, teacher transfers will be avoided. There has been a huge, and we do not want an exercise where teachers constantly have this fear of a Damocles sword of getting transferred so often. So we want, as far as possible, that teachers are appointed to schools, and this is largely for the government teachers, that they are appointed to the schools that is closest to their places of work, and transfer should not be the norm, but should be an exception. And if at all there are transfers, that they should take into consideration what is best suited for that particular teacher and permit that kind. At the same time, we have said that we will have professional development of teachers by giving them that kind of training, continuous training, including the fact that we have said there could be fast track promotions. And I don't think there could be a better incentive for that rather than having fast track promotions. So, and by 2030, when we are actually saying that all teachers would be those who have B.Ed qualification, then you have a proper career graph. I fully admit that for the new teachers, that is going to be very easy. But for those who are in service also, we said their teaching duties, they should not, as far as possible, be taken away from their teaching duties. So you are all aware that in government schools, the teachers double up as those who implement the midday meal. They are going to buy the supplies. Then the state government calls them for the census. Then the state government calls them for the election duty. Continuously, there are so many non-academic activities in which they are being involved in. We would like to see all this being actually rationalized. It is a fact that that is the largest workforce and therefore, and the most educated workforce. Therefore, we use them for these operations of census and election and so on. But to what extent these can be minimized or these can be rationalized, avoid teacher transfers, avoid them from doing non-academic works, at the same time allow them for continuous training by which they can, we have envisaged. In fact, it is very, if I may anecdotally say, when the chairman, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, was discussing about the pay structure of the teachers, and most of us were faculty from higher education. He said, you people should be paid less. Actually, the ECC teachers should be paid the most, so we should invert the pay structure, because they are the ones who are putting their maximum time and energy in molding the children. And actually, you're getting a finished product in the college and much easier to deal with. Therefore, actually, the teachers who are teaching in the school should have higher pay structures. Now, this is to understand that we recognize that teachers will have to be trained, they will be incentivized, there will be fast track promotions. Those who do innovative things in teaching, we will recognize them and try and see if there can be different channels to double up their pay packages. So we have kept many provisions which might be most evident if you start reading those 2 or 3 sections that we have devoted for teachers, and the national curriculum framework for teacher education that is going to come about. And that will actually think in terms of trying to incentivize innovative teaching. And therefore, the flexibility that teachers have in the classroom situation, though the broad curriculum is there, is something that will actually motivate teachers more to actually perform better. And all incentivization need not necessarily be monetary alone. It can also be a recognition of the teachers for the efforts that they're doing to mold the future of this country.
So I have a related question from Tamil Nadu. Teacher from Tamil Nadu, Abhinaya Sridharan. She's asking same question in a different, I think her issues slightly different here. She says Digital India may not solely bear the burden of all these changes that we are proposing, because digital is not the solely solution. So especially in the case of literacy and numeracy for children aged 1 to 5, how state governments are going to cope up with these new challenges? What way they could address these issues, especially at the lower level, when teachers also to be trained? I think she's a teacher.
Actually, that is where we have talked about this national mentorship program. We are thinking of having this national mentorship program where we will be able to identify community workers, retired teachers, people who are senior students also who might like to come into the picture, the students from higher education system who would like to be a part of that volunteer group, and in coordinated effort with the teacher, so that the teacher is not overburdened. But since the teacher knows the student the best, their role in actually being a bridge between the student and this community worker or this mentor or this volunteer who is coming, we are hoping to address that learning crisis of foundational literacy and numeracy. So in the draft NEP, we had actually talked about remedial instructional aids program and a national tutors program. But what did not find favor when it was put up in public domain to receive comments was that this would be one more channel in which we may have para teachers or shiksha karmis or those phenomenon that is there where you do not have qualified people coming in and actually starting to come into the business of school teaching and then claim that they should be made permanent. So we had to drop this idea of the National Tutors Program and the Remedial Aids, Instructional Aids Program. This is commonly done in many other Western countries, but here, because there is an economic crisis, we find that it might not have the intended outcome. But as rightly felt, let the teachers not feel that this burden of addressing the foundational literacy and numeracy is going to completely fall onto their shoulders, because we are looking at a mentorship program and community workers and social workers who would be thoroughly sort of screened from the point of view of child safety and then inducted, so that there will be an additional support to the schooling system to look at this crisis between grades 1 to grades 3.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Simili Sam. Simili is also a teacher. She's asking about the classroom ratio and the content in the holistic and creative learning system or method in NEP. How are we going to, ensure that this classroom ratio and content could be justifiable in the changing circumstances?
I think the policy I think all of us as individuals, as teachers, parents, and whatever role we are, children are not robots and children are not clones of each other. Every child, even if you have two sibling children and there are two siblings in the family, they'll think differently, they will act differently, they have different likes and tastes. How do we forget that when we become a teacher and get into a class of 30 students and think all those 30 have the same intellectual capabilities, the same talents, the same potentials? Let us respect that every child is unique, may have disabilities, may be good in a subject, may not be good in another subject, and it is the teacher, just as the teacher is playing the role of a mother in the classroom situation, to identify that, and that is possible. You have a lot of tests which can help us to understand who are the high achievers, the low achievers for different subjects, having different aptitude for different subjects. And when children start taking up these subjects, and when you actually relate to their learning, and which is what happens in the lower classes, you have only one teacher for all those subjects, so that you actually connect to the class as a whole, but recognize that each one of them is unique. We are not, we have done grave injustice by actually treating all of them. In fact, a NASA report is a very telling statement on this, that all children are creative when they enter the schooling system. And when they come out of the schooling system, we have created them as robots, incapable of thinking individually and incapable of acting in an independent manner. If we are talking about learning in the 21st century, there is a wonderful report of the UNESCO, and I'll urge all of you all to read it, Learning the Treasure Within, which is commonly referred to as the Delors Commission report, which says learning is not unidimensional. It is learning to know, which is the knowledge aspect. It is learning to do things practically, learning to live together and to live with others, to live the social animal that every individual is, and learning to be, which is the optimization of individual talents. As teachers and as educators, let us understand that every child, just as your own children, if you are having 2 or 3 of them, each child is different in the likings, in their dislikes, and that is where, when they come into the class, if that's a class of 30 or a class of 20, let's not look at those 20 as one block, but look at them as 20 living human beings having different tastes and different talents, and don't feel that it is unjustified that we treat all the 20 differently, but treat them as one. By doing that, we are not having the right kind of mechanisms. Learning competency should be assessed. Therefore, if somebody is good at maths, let them perform well in maths. Somebody is good in music, let them perform well in music. Let's not say the person, it is like saying that famous video which is going around, don't teach a fish how to climb a tree. Right now, we are trying to do that. It's almost impossible. And therefore, as teachers, let us try to understand that every child is unique, and let us recognize that potential. And in the 21st century, this is what becomes most important.
Ma'am, I think Simri also has, one more question regarding it. We are coming to the end. Probably I'll take 2 more questions. This is regarding the content and activities. So I remember in Kerala, I'm sure you also recall this, when DPEP was introduced.
Yes.
A lot of you had cried. I was in school that I still remember lots of issues were there. It was all about activity, because we are conventionally, oriented to a set of systems. So immediately people are not ready to change. And I'm even told in the last year when I was discussing NEP, many school teachers were discussing. Finally, the parents are only looking at the grace mark and progress report, how much marks the kids are scoring, and you say all these things will take ages for them to understand. So the question here is content and activity, and how are we going to orient the parents also regarding these changes, because that is also important for the successful implementation of national education.
Yes. So the parental preparedness is something that we were very conscious about. And that is why we were saying that, the current mechanism where particularly parents not coming from the, who come from those socioeconomic backgrounds where they send their child because they have not gone to a school, and therefore they think that the child should be able to come back, recite something in English, count something in English, and therefore English is the only window in which they can perform and things like that. But on the activity-based learning and making a balance that is required to the degree of activities depends upon the way that content needs to be actually transacted. And therefore, you need not have, just because there has got to be an activity, introduce an activity. But it is like if that content can be better understood with an activity, and therefore the kind of the pedagogy that we use actually needs some sort of modification, because the teacher will therefore take a very considered view whether we should have an activity, not because it has to be there, but because it helps the child in understanding something in a better manner, and therefore the ability to translate that into real life context becomes easy. For example, if you're teaching history for a child who's there in the middle school level, and you talk about a history which the child does not relate to at all, then you tell the child, you draw a picture of any historical event that you are thinking of. That's an activity that 10 children in the class will bring you 10 different charts. But that makes the child understand that this is something that the child has understood. And it can be something very idiosyncratic, but for that matter, but you need to appreciate the fact that the child has tried to understand something. And then you can say, okay, this is not history, but this is something that you're trying. The child may draw some historical place, or may draw something about a war, or may say something about a particular cartoon character which is being portrayed, whatever it is. But activity, because it has to be there, is not what the policy is saying. Activity, to the extent that the content transaction helps the child in the learning process, is what we are looking at. What happens in the lopsided understanding is that activity hona hai, sorry, I am usually that Hindi stuff, that activity has to be there, activity ondavanam, adna vendit or activity kondu varnadu, that is not what we are trying to say. And activity, insofar as it facilitates or encourages the learner to understand that particular aspect better, is where that activity needs to come. So that is why this balance is something that each teacher, and that's why when I talk about the NEP implementation, I have a standard phrase which I say, the implementation is not by someone else. The implementation is by each one of us in our own minute manner. And parents, we are doubling up. We are teachers and parents. And let us also understand, let's spread the advocacy around of how to actually make our other parents who are not teachers to understand that it is not the marks. Can you trace as a teacher today where that meritorious student of your class 10 in your school, if you are a teacher and if you are a principal, take out your class 10 results 10 years back and track those students. What are they doing in life today? Do we do that? I think that's where lies the answer. Some of the very high performers may have been failures in life. And some of those, there are living examples, we all know that, who were actually class dropouts, have become those who started their startups and have become great achievers. So it's not the marks that go to make it an individual, but it is what goes to make a complete human being that education is all about.
I think with that, I think we can conclude the session, ma'am. I think it has taken a lot of time and effort from your side to explain. And I have one, before we end this session, while I was reading this, I read that 400-page or 384-page first draft, and then the later draft also. I was reading this latest draft. This is nothing to do with the question. I'm not asking about NEP and the framework. The language, the way it is being written, it actually caught my attention. I've been going through different policies in different sectors for so many years. This particular policy document for me looks a little different. It looks like an academic research paper. Okay, it was not the typical policy brief that we see in government circulation. I know the second page talks about the pursuit of knowledge, jnana, wisdom, pragya, and truth, satya, was always considered in Indian thought and philosophy as the highest human goal. these kinds of wordings, these kinds of expressions are not mostly we write when you do the academy papers, but it's not so often seen in the policy papers. So could you give some insights to we discuss lots of serious issues, but give a lighter and lighter note to end to the conversation. Could you give some insights, because I'm sure there are so many students are also participating. What is the way? What was in all your minds when you were writing this policy document? Because it's going to influence, because this policy comes after 34 years. I'm sure, I don't know when is next policy is going to come in India. So it is going to impact at least 3 or 4 generations, at least, my conservative estimate. Millions of children, a future of the country. So what was in your mind? Because, my colleagues are also here attending this, policy researchers are here. So we would like to hear from you. What was in your mind when you were writing this policy?
No, so the draft NEP, the 484-page document, we had a formal drafting committee and they were writing it out and we were iterating it and things like that. But right from the start in the committee, we were very clear that we were not going to bring out something that is going to look like a drab government document which reads like a policy in cryptic language. And since education is something that touches the lives of all people, we wanted that the most common people, when they read it, should enjoy reading that document. And you see, when you talk about the government is bringing out the Economic Survey of India, because we are in government and we are trying to understand where we stand, we read the Economic Survey of India. Or if you are having an industrial policy, we read that. Incidentally, I tell the group there is a draft science, technology and innovation policy with which also I was associated, which is in public domain and which has a lot of recommendations on how science education needs to be taken forward, is also up for seeking comments. Now, when we wrote the NEP 2020, the crisp document of 66 pages, it was really a challenge because it was very clear from the government point that don't write a 500-page document and give it to us saying that's the policy. That's why we could not call it the policy. We ideally would have liked that being called the policy, but that is not being treated as the policy, and we had to put that in a very crisp form into a smaller document. It evolved to become 66 pages, putting in all the ideas, and went around in different dimensions, but all less than 100 pages. But when we wanted to read it, and people like Manjul Bhargav and the secretaries to the department and others who have contributed to the NEP 2020, I'm not talking about the draft NEP in 2019, the NEP 2020. We wanted that the essence of what we wrote in the draft should be captured in that very first chapter. And that is why the goals, the overall context of the SDGs, the context of India as a nation, what the previous policies did, and the cardinal principles, the 22 cardinal principles, saying that this entire policy should be read in a continuum and that these principles form the core thinking throughout. That was the flow that we were trying to actually achieve. So the idea of making it look like a typical government policy was something which we consciously tried to abstain ourselves from and give it a kind of a flavor that every person, that is, we said, whoever takes this policy in hand, reading the first 2 or 3 pages should make them feel, and why the diagram? You see, that diagram that we have put in that is never done in a policy. But we thought that the diagram brings forward what is that 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. And that first 5 years, which we show as blank, which is not there right now, that is the preschool stage that we are talking about, the 3 to 6-year-old. We deliberately kept that box as blank. That evolved at a much later stage because no matter what we were trying to convince people in the government that this is essential, they were saying because it is Women and Child Development Ministry handling it, why should we get that ECC to us? But we said that this is the reason. It is like a tree without the foundation or without the roots, and therefore we introduced that diagram. It's not there in a policy always, but we wanted the common person to understand the rationale for that. And that is why the language flow and other aspects have come in. And one must credit the fact that we had, even while writing the NEP 2020, Professor Manjul Bhargav, who is a field specialist, and who has spent most of his time helping us out in doing this, and all of us adding on to that. But the draft NEP had a separate drafting committee, which had Leena Wadia, which had Anurag Beher, which had Professor Ramachandran, and also Manjul Bhargav. And yes, these were the 4 people who were there. The draft NEP acknowledges their contribution. But we did not want even the final policy to read like a simple government report. We wanted it to be something that inspires parents, inspires students, inspires policymakers and government functionaries in reading it like it is it's like a dream book that you read to achieve that in a period of about 20 years. At least by 2040, we hope that the NEP would get implemented in letter and spirit.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insights. Incredible insights, I would say, because I heard many speaking on NEP the last 2 years since the draft came out. I also participated many discussion forums, but I think you made it very simple. You give us insights that probably none others have done so far. And also I kept this question towards the end because this was also very educating to me, that policy briefs are also the way we are writing policy briefs in government is also changing. I think since 2016, when Dr. Arvind Subramanian was the advisor, economic advisor to government, he changed the economic review style that has been now carried over the years. So I'm sure, I hope the new education policy also become a talking point in the country, I think, because of the way it is presented. 66 pages, actually you enjoy reading it, you can agree and disagree, but you really enjoy it. So thank you so much for your time, ma'am. We are thankful to you for spending 2 hours explaining NEP and how this is going to impact our school education and what are the positive outcomes that we expect. I'm sure we will be doing organizing talk series on higher education in the immediate future. Looking forward to the conversation, and I'm sure all the participants also benefited from your insights and understanding about NEP. Thanks to Nisi to conclude the session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Shamsu, ma'am, and Dr. Dhanu for this insightful session. We would, with that, conclude today's webinar. I would like to thank all the participants who actively participated in the webinar, and just a reminder that we would continue with the Education Dialogue series. So you may follow our updates on our social media handle, CPPR India. And you could share your thoughts and continue the discussion using the hashtag Education Dialogues. And thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you next time.